Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Winchester 1887 lever-action shotgun. And while it isn't the first repeating shotgun, it was the first for Winchester. Before we continue, however, let's go ahead and get this into the lightbox. Lengths and weights may vary depending on barrel length. In my case, this is a 30-inch barrel, which gives us a 47-inch overall length and a weight of 7.6 pounds. All of the examples should have a magazine capacity of 5 rounds. This is, of course, the 12-gauge shotgun cartridge, though later the 10-gauge was also introduced. While most of you are familiar with our recurring sponsor, who we chose ourselves after using their do-all gun oil for years ahead of time, this is a good moment to remind you that Ballistol is an excellent product to use against both black powder and smokeless fouling. I'll also remind you that we put out a challenge to get you guys to go out and buy the really big gallon cans of Ballistol, mostly because I found them funny, but also very useful. And George has knocked one out of the park, as you can tell, with this not really recommended use of Ballistol, but still an entertaining one. And of course, as always, this show is almost exclusively funded by you, our patrons. So if you want us to keep digging, help us afford those shovels with just $1 or up to $5 a month. Before we start our history today, I'll point out that despite being an icon of the latter days of the Wild West, a favorite of movie fans due to its appearance in popular media, the Winchester 1887 lever shotgun is one of the least loved products when it comes to research and writing. Frankly, very little has actually been written about this gun, especially the why of its existence. Now, I do have a theory, which I have not actually seen espoused anywhere else, but for you to understand it, we'll need a little more context. Oliver Fisher Winchester, born in Boston, November of 1810, had been a clothing manufacturer before wisely investing in the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company, which he would then work to transform into the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. By the time that our story today begins, however, Winchester's company was now very well established, and he was at the end of his days, passing away in December of 1880 and leaving his son in charge of the company. William Wirt Winchester, however, was already sick with tuberculosis, and sadly passed away just a few months after his father. From here, his widow's relations took up more interest in the company. In particular, the husband of her eldest sister became president. His leadership was apparently quite capable in terms of general business sense, but our story has to do with a sort of commercial war between Winchester and Colt, which was led by Thomas Gray Bennett. Sportsman and veteran, Bennett had been a first lieutenant during the American Civil War. He came to work at Winchester in 1870 as an apprentice engineer, though Oliver Winchester found in him a capable all-around businessman. In 1872, Bennett married Winchester's daughter, Hannah Jane Winchester. From here, Bennett became Winchester's primary foreign sales agent. While good for his career, he missed his family greatly, ultimately returning home and coming to serve as treasurer after Winchester's death and vice president after son William's passing. Though not as critical for our story today, he would eventually become president of Winchester Repeating Arms in 1890. Regardless of his title at any given time, we care about Bennett for 2 reasons today. The first of which is that he was willing to go to war with Colt's patent firearms in order to preserve Winchester's share of the market. This feud requires a bit of understanding. By 1880, Colts would be famous for their revolvers, particularly at that time the single-action Army model of 1873. And despite adding some less popular double actions to the line, Colt did not remain a wheel-gun-only arms producer. Their model of 1878 hammer-fired, breech-loading, double-barreled shotgun looked to invade the U.S. sporting shotgun market, its nearest competitor being Remington's Whitmore. Up until that is, Winchester got involved in this market. At the time, especially in New York City, there was a groundswell of interest in commercial shotguns, likely brought on in part by the growing interest in competitive shotgun sports like the then nascent trap shooting. Arms, powder, and ammunition manufacturers, of course, encouraged this interest as it meant a great deal of potential profit. And Winchester Repeating Arms did not miss the trend. However, they were well behind Colt and Remington in terms of designing or tooling up to produce a good double-barreled shotgun. So they actually chose to import them from Britain, at first a smattering of cheap, plain examples, which sold briskly and encouraged a heavier investment, partnering with Christopher G. Bonehill of Birmingham to produce Winchester-branded double-barrel shotguns. These were, however, pricey guns, so they didn't start out as a clear threat to the others. In 1881, though, they switched contractors to Richard Redmond, also of Birmingham. These shotguns were considerably cheaper, even for the same quality. Winchester also began importing inexpensive British shotguns by other makers in larger numbers. By 1882, these Winchester imports came to dominate the New York shotgun market and edged out Remington and Colt's sales enough to be a significant nuisance. Remington wasn't in the best financial shape and could hardly fire back at Winchester regardless. But Colt's patent firearms were ready for a fight. They announced plans to introduce a new repeating lever-action rifle to challenge Winchesters. This would be based on work by Burgess and Brewer. They also pushed a Buy American campaign to push both the public and the government to resist the inexpensive imports. In retaliation, Winchester imported 600 Philip Webley & Sons double-action revolvers. I'm unsure of the exact model, to be honest, but these were for sale in New York, deeply discounted below the cost of Colt's Model 1878 double-action revolver. Winchester also hired away Colt's engineer, William Mason, and put him to work on a series of prototype revolvers. This information was, of course, allowed to be leaked to the trade. It's no surprise that in 1883, Colt put their lever gun into production. If this wasn't bad enough, a new tariff action in March of that year also required a 35% duty on sporting breech loaders entering the U.S. market from abroad. Winchester would need to respond yet again, but this time VP Bennett wanted to decisively end the fight. In February of 1884, he got permission from Winchester's board of directors to resolve the issue, even if it resulted in significant financial loss in the near term for the company. His plans received approval, and so he got to work. Feigning to cave to both public pressure and clamoring from their own agent to buy American, Winchester publicly announced that they were halting the import of British shotguns. They then quietly dumped their entire inventory at one time into the dealer market at about 67 cents on the dollar. That basically destroyed the New York shotgun market for any competitor for the next 2 years. They also announced publicly that they would enter the revolver market and produce a slide-action rifle, targeting Colt's then fairly new Lightning carbine. This salvo brought the companies to the negotiating table, specifically with a meeting of the VPs, on June 1st of 1884. Colt's William Franklin met with Thomas Bennett, who showed him firsthand their prototype revolvers and slide-action rifle. The meeting's notes were sadly not recorded, but Bennett's diary succinctly recounts that they agreed to no longer interfere in each other's markets. Colt went so far as to withdraw the Burgess lever-action rifle from production, and Winchester abandoned their revolvers. It seems that on the surface, Winchester had yielded the shotgun market, as they had no manufacture of their own, but we know that won't last. The catalyst for change seems to have come from a young inventor, John Moses Browning, born and raised in the rapidly changing American frontier town of Ogden, Utah. John Moses had come to Winchester's attention when an agent found he and his brothers were producing a hand-loading tool that infringed on Winchester's patent. They also discovered that he was producing a single-shot rifle of excellent design. Contracting with the Brownings in 1883, this would eventually become the Winchester single-shot rifle of 1885. Browning then went on to further secure Winchester's lever-action line by designing what became the model of 1886. Now, each of these designs trailed their purchase from Browning by several years. Each patent was bought outright with a direct payment. Browning wouldn't switch to a royalty payment system for some time to come. So in order to get paid, John Moses had to keep inventing. Speaking with Bennett, the next product they needed for the Winchester line was a shotgun. Given that this is Winchester repeating arms, it's best if it works from a magazine. Browning apparently favored using a slide-action operation. I'm unsure of his initial plans, but this patent filed in December of 1885 at least shows his first completed recorded design. Winchester, it seems, rejected it. Now, at this point, the fact that Winchester didn't want a slide action is often shrugged off as, well, they are a lever gun company, but as we saw, they had been happy to pursue the break-action shotgun market even when they weren't actually producing their own model. I suspect that their rejection of a slide-action shotgun may have been, at least in part, influenced by their still very recent truce with Colt patent firearms. Remember, Colt already had a pump in the market. Avoiding the still live wire was probably a good way to say, see, we're abiding by our agreement. Now, that doesn't mean that they had some obligation to abandon shotguns, but working up a break-action double just meant competing in the already muddy market, and again would poke a fresh wound. Now, if the shotgun was a repeating lever action, who could really blame them? That's kind of their thing. Anyway, I suspect all of this adds up to Winchester strongly desiring a specific sort of shotgun. This goal was given to John Moses Browning, who thankfully did have the ability to rend such a near impossible design into actual steel, even if he wasn't too excited by it. It seems he may have iterated on an earlier concept of his, in which the lever and breech block are one component which rotates backwards, pointing the breech face at the sky when open. When closed up, the rear of the breech block locks against the inside rear of the receiver. Filed for patent in August of 1883, this efficient rifle uses a tipping elevator to feed from the tubular magazine below the barrel. Browning's first patent for a shotgun today actually precedes the one later filed for the slide action that I mentioned earlier. This doesn't mean that it was invented first, it just means that he knew he could make money off of this patent first. Filing it in June of 1885, we actually have most of our gun today put to paper. Here we have a lever-operated breech block which rotates about 90 degrees to open. While this is compared to the rolling block fairly often, the lockup is entirely different, as the breech block doesn't just rotate, but it also rises slightly into or falls slightly out of locking engagement with the rear of the receiver. The block carries with it both the firing pin and the hammer, with the latter engaging directly on the trigger to cock on close. While the cartridge elevator, stops, and other magazine features seem to have been thought out, they are not particularly covered in detail. The extractor is fairly complicated, and we'll see that change soon. Filing in July of 1886, John Moses has worked up a simple pivoting extractor powered by its own plunger and spring. This allows the rotating block to better keep its grasp on the extracted case or cartridge until it can be flicked from the action. Now, Browning was in the habit of providing a working model to Winchester's engineers, who then worked it over into as smooth and attractive of an arm as they could manage. And the results, well, actually, it's this gun here. Almost exactly this one, actually, as this is a very early example. So let's use it to get a closer look. From the top, we have a little tiny bead sight at the end of our 30-inch long barrel. We have an underhanging magazine tube, a fairly long forestock with a single screw at the moment. And if we get into here, we see our big receiver section. We're actually going to focus on that in a moment. But first, we'll keep on coming down to see our semi-pistol grip buttstock. Obviously, this is a sort of two-piece stock. It's actually a three-piece stock in the sense that the forend is made out of two panels. And then we just have a buttstock at the rear of the gun. We have a high, sharp comb. And then at the back, we have a steel checkered butt plate. The buttstock itself is actually fairly thick at the rear, which is really good for going ahead and distributing that recoil across your shoulder. I wouldn't say it's soft shooting, but this certainly helps. Closing in on the receiver, we have a beautiful monogram for Winchester Repeating Arms Company. There's our big C going around, our big W. This was designed by John Ulrich, like most Winchester engravings. And then if we look over the top, there's nothing really up here, but under the lever, on the lower tang, we can see manufactured by the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, New Haven, Connecticut, and some patent dates, which we're already aware of in our show so far. Now, the action as a whole is, of course, lever. We pop that guy open, and the whole thing flips up. As you can probably see, our breech block is integral to our lever. It just comes on back and points to the sky. This little bit sticking out here is actually our hammer. So as we close, it will snag on the trigger, and then at that moment, it starts to cock. You can see the little nub in there. Let me get you a better look. Right there. See how the hammer spur, which is down in there, it moves along with our breech until we get to this point. So when it's snagged on the trigger and it stays still, that's the cocking action, which is actually compressing the spring down in here. And then we're cocked and ready to go. From here, we can pull the trigger. It's going to drop the hammer. There is a half cock position, which is annoying to use. It kind of wants to over travel when you pull it, and then you have to kind of cock it back. Or if you're really careful, you can preload it and ease it down, but it's actually fairly shallow compared to it's not really in the half. It's more of a 1/4 cock. But at that point, if we pull the trigger, she's locked up and the gun won't go until we recock. Just to see that hammer better, we can see it from overhead. If I ride it and pull the trigger, we could ease it down into the fired position where it strikes the firing pin. The half cock would be right there. Again, nothing happening. Full cock is just a little bit further out. A lot of people complain that because of this recessed hammer spur that rides inside this groove and barely sticks out at all, you need a lot of thumb strength, and you got to preload the hammer in order to ease it into the half cock position, which is actually a very short maneuver anyway. This means a lot of people tend to slip and just go ahead and discharge around when they didn't really mean to. There is a trick to doing this a little bit easier, or at least less likely to set off a round. It has to do with pre-manipulating the trigger. If we open the action like normal, imagining that our hand is riding along with this lever, and we try to close it back up, I can't actually pull the trigger so long as I'm riding inside the trigger guard. It actually intersects there, and it remains unpullable thanks to the shape of the backside inside this handle. See, I can't flex on it, and then at the end I suddenly could. That little finger there sticking off the back meets a recess that's cut into the trigger guard, which essentially serves as an out-of-battery disconnect for the trigger. See the recess? It has to meet the fold in the trigger. But, like I said, we can sort of pre-manipulate the hammer by playing with this trigger out of the trigger guard. So, in theory, if we had one in the chamber that we didn't want to set off by accident, we could go ahead and get to this part in closing the gun, manipulate the trigger ahead of closing the lever, at which point the hammer's just going to come on down gently. Not enough to set off a cartridge, one would hope, but also not a great idea to carry it around this way in case you get some inertial bounce. A better way is if you get right to the load point, back off a bit, pull the trigger, let her forward just a smidge, release, and then what you catch on is the half cock, at which point, yeah, no bang, oh, we're not doing anything. Now, of course, that's a lot to explain. Winchester didn't intend it to work this way, but I did find it to be a lot easier to manipulate the hammer that way, especially if you want to be easy on one of these old grills because these mainsprings tend to break and you want to let the pressure off as you're closing the action. Well, you can certainly, instead of trying to ride that spur with your thumb, go ahead and pull this guy, get your big old finger out of the way as it closes up, and then you're decocked all the way through and the gun's resting with the spring compressed. Now, our breech block does not just rotate. If you're watching very carefully, it's easier to see on the closing stroke because there's no spring tension. It rises somewhat. See how we're rotating, and then all of a sudden here, we start sort of camming in this direction, and there is a sort of linear hole milled in here to drive us up over that pin, or not over, but along the pin, until we rise and fill out basically this whole back wall of the receiver. So it's a bit hard to see in here, might be easier in animation. Let me show it to you from over top as we close. That last little bit is gonna pop up. See the rise? That is where we're locking up against the back of the receiver. So we're not like a rolling block that's locked up by the hammer and a big pin. We're actually getting the full support at the rear of this receiver. And when we open the gun up, of course, the opposite is true. We drop down a little bit and then rotation begins. So the first stroke actually drops us, then we rotate. That's rather lovely. While we're in here, I should say it's a bit hard to show you on camera, but as the shooter or as someone coming around to clean the gun later, you can see straight down the bore with no problem. There's no need to take the gun apart to clean out the barrel, which might have saved on some of the dirt in this gun if somebody had bothered to do that. Present dirt aside, this locking surface being so far back away from, as a matter of fact, you can see it right there, having it so far back away from the chamber means that black powder fouling, which this gun was chambered for black powder 12 gauge cartridges or 10 gauge depending on the variation of the 1887, that means that that fouling is very unlikely to make it all the way back to your locking surface or onto your sear surfaces, which makes this a much safer gun and allows you to run it longer before cleanings, or at least, especially if you're marching out into the wilderness to use it over a couple of days. This gives you some time to actually use it before you have to start scrubbing it. So not a terrible concept, really. Looking down from on top with our action open, we see here's our breech face. Up underneath everything you're seeing here is technically parts of the breech block, but it's kind of hard for you to see. Down this center section is what I'm calling the elevator assembly. If we fully open the action, it pops on up. Now that camming is done just like it would be on a Kropatschek. There's interaction between the breech block and some rear tabs on that elevator. So you'll see that better in an animation, but you get the idea. At the last moment, we pop this thing up. As we do that, you may notice this guy right here. This one is the same-ish, but static. This one, however, has some flex. These are essentially a pair of feed lips, although they work rather unusual in that they grip our cartridge only as we're reaching that last bit of travel because we don't want to accidentally throw it out of the action. So let's see if we can see that again. if we're down, so the breech block is sort of further forward, then there's no tension on this piece right here, all right? But if I open it all the way up, you'll see it pop over, and it pops over with gusto. If I hold the lever open and try to push on that, I end up moving the lever. See, they're actually tied together only in that last bit of motion. But that's very critical because in that last bit of motion is also when the whole elevator snaps up. And so what that does is it grabs the cartridge and keeps it from being ejected from the action instead of feeding, which would be a really big problem. You'd have to feed this very slowly otherwise. Now, if you want to load the gun, you can either take your cartridge and put it right on here and push on down, or since I want to show you guys this, I'll just go ahead and push that lower, and then boom, there is our follower coming out of our magazine with its big old coil spring down in there. So if I were to push that down and then start feeding our cartridges, we can put them into the elevator, which it kind of clicks in. Then we can push it into the magazine tube, and it definitely thunks in there. Now, of course, since I'm trying to do this for the camera, I keep bumping the lever, so it's fighting me a bit. But in person, it's actually quite smooth to do when you're just sort of holding it over your arm. Now, I fed 2 in the magazine. It will have a capacity of 5, but we're just using some dummies today, and I don't want to fill it all the way up. If we had filled the magazine with 5, we could take a 6th round, and we could put it on the elevator or in the chamber. Either would work out pretty fine. If we choose to put it on the elevator, we will have to work our action once more to get it up, and then we'll have to close the lever in order to feed it. Now, at this point, things never really work in slow motion on the early versions of these guns. And there's a good reason for that we'll see in a moment. But just to show you, if I close this slowly, yeah, it's gone ahead and tied up. That's a real pain. The better trick is to snap it closed quickly, which is something I had to reposition for. Works fine every time as long as you have a little inertia. Now, the reason for that problem is here. There. Sorry, a bit hard to do upside down in the camera. But this little tab projects off the right side of the bolt, at least on this early version of the gun. And it will crash into this guy first and help drive down our elevator. Now, I can show that to you. And boom, there's the contact. And it's going to start pushing that out of its way. Now, that is a wear part. And unfortunately, it does require a little bit of oomph to get through when you have a casing there especially. So once that drives over, you're fine. But if you don't get that momentum just right, that collision happens a bit too late and the whole thing tends to tie up, especially moving slow. Now, this would be rectified later in the design by moving that tab to the left side of the bolt and making it much larger, although we're going to see that a little bit later. Now, because I can't feed slowly, it's very hard to let you hear what I want you to hear, so we'll pretend we're feeding around. And I want you to listen to that magazine because it's going to feed right as we close the block. Now, it's a big clunk, and a big part of that clunk isn't the receiver making that noise. Instead, it was our next round getting onto the elevator. So, essentially, it does release onto the elevator only at that last moment of closure. We can actually see that fairly well at the bottom. What's peeking through this hole in front of our lever is actually the bottom of our elevator. The face of it is over here, blocking those cartridges from feeding from the magazine. As we close the gun up, you'll see it starts to get lower and lower, although in this case it's higher in your perspective, and then it will snug right in there. Now, if I close this very gently on this worn gun that is upside down, so gravity's working against us, it's actually just enough that you guys didn't hear any sound, did you? Well, that's because, at the moment, it hasn't quite let go of the cartridge that's still in the magazine. Although, well, let's see if I can nudge it, or if I can give it a little... There we go. The momentum was just enough to carry it over, and you certainly heard it that time. And you can see we're actually true flush. If you ever play with an 87, you can actually finagle this a bit by putting your thumb up against this and holding it up while closing the action softly, and it probably won't feed from the magazine just because of the loose tolerances after being over 140 years old. Now, from here, we would fire our shotgun. It would discharge it if it were a live round and if I had actually let it drop. And then if we rack her open, we'll see that extraction starts off as fairly linear because of our offset extractor. As a matter of fact, there's a better angle. Notice that our cartridge, really, or in this case, it would have been a spent casing, is almost, perfectly in line with our bore, and yet our breech block is pointed all the way out here. That's because of that pivoting extractor that's still holding on in there. There you can see how it's turned the corner. Once we get all the way back, it's going to run out of room, and hit the ejector, and that's going to pop on out. And from there we can feed our next cartridge, which again, if you do slowly, it hates. Let's do that one more time, see if you guys can see it. Sorry about all the bobbing. This is really fun to do with a lever and a camera on a tripod, but there we go. And that's how we would feed all of our cartridges. Again, better with gusto than to go slow. If I get this guy out, oof, we can take a better look at our firing pin. Presently, the hammer is not being retained by the sear underneath, and therefore the hammer is actually still resting on the firing pin even at this moment, which might seem a little bit dangerous because that means it's projected forward as we're closing the bolt. But when we get to the point that the hammer snags on the sear, see how it's coming off the firing pin at the rear there, it also means that it's come off the firing pin at the front, and you notice that it immediately disappears. That's because there is a coil spring in there constantly driving the firing pin back out of the breech face in order to hopefully avoid a slam fire situation in case it happens to get stuck with gunk. So not 100% guaranteed like a positive firing pin retractor, which we actually will have added to this gun later on in a different form, but at least, you know, it's something in this era. Now, in case you're curious, there is a gas relief hole for cartridge failure here at the front top of the breech block, and then this groove right here along the front of the receiver is actually a sighting groove meant to work with the front sight. This is like a dished out section. You would line up that bead inside of it to center it up. Not only does it give you a perspective on left and right, but also emulates the previous double barrel shotguns, which everyone was familiar with, instead of trying to go for, say, some sort of complicated rifle sight. Now, as for finish, this one looks like mottled brown and silver, but if you look real closely, you may see a very dim old pseudo rainbow of colors in there. Unfortunately, it's very easy to wear off, but these were color case hardened from the factory, at least as far as the receiver goes. The barrel and magazine tube were blued along with some other various parts. Just because it will come up later, I'll point out the single screw and escutcheon that holds our forend together. It goes all the way through. And then our magazine is hung by having a soldered lug on the barrel, and then a screw that mounts through this little guy that forms the cap of the end of the magazine. Now, while a lot of this gun peeks out of the receiver whenever we open the action, it's not quite enough to understand how the whole thing works. So let's get a look at one of Bruno's animations.
While I know this looks complicated, I assure you the 1887 is a simple firearm. We just have to take it one step at a time. In order to load this shotgun, we'll first have to lever open the action. I'll point out now that the lever and breech block are all one large complicated piece. As we drop the lever, the breech opens up, with the breech face pointing to the sky. As we load our first cartridge, we'll manually depress the elevator, then shove the cartridge into the magazine tube. Each time we do so, the elevator presses into the corner of the breech block. This slightly compresses the mainspring, which we'll see better in a moment. All we need to know now is that the mainspring presses the block back, causing the elevator to rise slightly and serve as a cartridge stop. Now, in theory, we could leave an extra cartridge on the elevator, or thumb one in the chamber, but for now, let's see how to feed from the magazine. With the breech closed, it both makes room for the elevator to drop further and tips this floating lever, positively driving the elevator lower, which frees the next cartridge from the magazine. Now, if we open the action again, at the final bit of rotation, a set of lugs on the breech block meet the two wings at the rear of the elevator. This causes it to tip up quickly, somewhat like a Kropatschek magazine actually. This action can be sudden, so a set of guiding wings are connected to the elevator. Each carries a feed lip at its top to prevent the cartridge from being thrown from the action. While the one on the right is static, the one on the left actually has room to move. When the action is snapped open, the breech block's cam tips the wing into flapping against the cartridge, holding it tightly at the moment it might escape, but releasing pressure when we close the breech block. Once the cartridge is partially fed, the finger off the right of the breech block collides with the right side wing, driving it and the elevator down. With the round chambered, the elevator lever again pitches all the way down. Let's look at the lock work. This is the trigger. It's powered by its own flat spring, which keeps it pressed against the hammer. The hammer is powered by a fairly stout V-spring nestled inside the breech block. This spring also provides tension to the block, but we'll see that in a moment. The hammer has a long tail, which, at present, is caught on the trigger in the full cock position. When we pull the trigger, the hammer is free to fall. When the action is levered back open, the hammer's two notches skip by the trigger. As we close the action, the hammer again catches on the trigger, cocking as we close. Once again, this is the full cock position. The other C or notch represents the half cock position. If we pull back on the hammer before pulling the trigger, then lower the hammer slightly and release the trigger, we'll be in the half cock position. This notch fully wraps around the trigger C or extension, meaning we cannot pull the trigger or release the hammer to fall unless we cock it back again. Another safety is provided by the trigger, specifically this folded over nubbin at its lower tip. This extension fits in a groove cut into the rear of the trigger guard only when the lever is fully closed. In this way, the trigger can only be pulled when the system is properly in battery. In the early 1887s, we only have one extractor. This is mounted so that it can pivot. However, a coil spring and plunger inside keeps it detented so that it favors a centered, resting position. As we open up the action, the extractor will draw the casing from the chamber. It pivots to keep contact with the rim as the breech block rotates, up until the elevator rises and acts as an ejector, flinging the spent case from the action. On the closing stroke, the extractor slides over top of the next rim, and is then driven into a gap somewhat below and alongside of the barrel. This is the firing pin, which is retained by a cross pin and rebounded automatically by its own coil spring. That means the firing pin tries to stay retracted up until it's smacked hard by the hammer. This drives it into the primer, discharging the arm. As we open the breech, the firing pin stays under hammer pressure all the way until the hammer is recocked. Only then does the pin retract again. At the moment, the breech block is in the locked position. This means that the rear set vertical surfaces of the block are flush against the inside of the receiver, fully supported and quite strong against the linear pressure coming from the chamber. Now, take a look at this groove in the breech block's hinge point. The block doesn't just rotate, it also rises and falls along this groove. As we open the action, the block travels partially along this groove, lowering it out of lock with the receiver before rotating open. As we close the action back up, we reach the end of the road for rotation, but if we lift further, we travel along that linear groove once more, rising into lock. Now let's return to that mainspring, because it's doing more work than you might realize. Yes, it powers the hammer, but at its other end, it presses against the axis on which the breech rotates. At this moment, the mainspring is compressed, but also sits over center, high. That means it is biasing the breech block closed. With support from the shooter's hand, the action is held in lock. This bias remains even when we release the hammer and allow the spring to expand, driving it towards the firing pin. As we open the action, the spring's vertex travels back below that center line, now providing pressure towards the opening action. Even when the action is fully open, by the way, there is some room on the axis groove and in the mainspring, which, as we saw at the start of this animation, provides a bit of pressure on the elevator, thus creating a cartridge stop. There is no lock-open mechanism, so even when you empty, you can just snap the 1887 shut. There, not so bad, was it? Now let's go shoot it.
You know, one thing I love about this gun is that with the action open, you can see straight down the pipe. No bore obstruction risk, no accidentally loaded guns, no nothing. Now, the Winchester repeating shotgun was first announced in their June of 1887 catalog. Further descriptions in the 1888 catalog list the gun as having only 16 parts in all, which could be readily understood from the sectional cuts. They happily report that the trigger cannot be pulled until the breech is closed and locked, which is mostly true. It's specifically marketed as being good for shooting double birds, a nod to the growth of the shotgun sports. The gun was priced at $25 for the base model. This was a 30-inch barrel, full choke configuration unless otherwise specified. Common choices of the day were 32 inches or down to 22 and a quarter, which was generally for law enforcement or guard purposes. Barrels were rolled steel unless you opted for fancy options like Damascus at radically higher costs. Other features like, say, a nickel silver front sight or a center bead wood checkering or even metal engraving were also available. It's worth noting that Winchester also introduced a line of preloaded shotgun cartridges in 1887. At that time, almost all shotgun shells were bought unloaded and were filled to task by the shooter. These were, like the shotgun at that time, black powder loads, as smokeless had only just appeared that same year in France. It would take some time to be copied and refined into a commercial product. There was also an attempt to introduce a sort of slug cartridge for the 1887 action. Known as Winchester's 70-150, the bullet featured a hollow tube down its center and weighed between 600 and 900 grains depending. At the heavier end, the bullet still moved at an estimated 1,300 feet per second. That's thanks to 150 grains of black powder. This monstrous round was ultimately experimental, as it produced an obscene amount of recoil. It was only ever paired with a handful of prototype Winchester 1887s fitted with heavier barrels that had a little bit of ratchet rifling pattern in the last few inches of the bore at the muzzle end. If you'd like to learn more about this frankly insane Winchester cartridge, I'd recommend visiting Leverguns 50, who has recreated an example of this beast. Returning to our shotgun, over time the 1887 would be updated with various improvements. The gun remained just like this until November of 1887. Around serial number 22,000, a 10-gauge version was introduced. This was a larger cartridge, favored for larger or higher flying waterfowl. Basically, it gave an option for more powder and or shot, depending on the user's desired load. Around serial 28,000, a second extractor was fitted to the right side of the breech block. Extraction must have been suffering, perhaps under repeated firing. Winchester advised owners of earlier guns to have them sent in order to be fitted with the new second extractor, so you occasionally find earlier serials so updated. A small external screw was fitted as part of this changeover, serving as a guide pin for the new extractor. The distance between the smaller and larger screws can actually make for a quick tell on whether an 87 is in 12 or 10 gauge, though the barrels should be marked by that point. Examples do turn up both before and after the use of dual extractors with this left side receiver screw. While I can't find anyone writing on the subject, it appears to have been placed to prevent the left side extractor from being able to dive just before closing the breech, which could have resulted in breakages of said extractor. It would later be replaced by moving the indexing finger thing, which was there to make early impact with the elevator, driving it back down as the action was closed. This was moved from the right side to the left, where it accomplished the same goal. Actually, it seems to have been enlarged to better engage and better time the dropping of the elevator, as it's less likely to jam some of these later model guns by moving slowly. It also supported the left side extractor from diving too far down, and therefore could replace that screw we saw on the left side of the receiver. I'll also point out another change that I'm not sure when it occurred. This pyramid was added to the front of, I'm just going to call it the elevator tongue for now. This improved feeding of the cartridges because it kept them from binding up against that sharp edge right at the corner of the elevator. Both the forend and the magazine hanger would be updated in roughly the same period. The old hanger was soldered to the barrel and a tab from the magazine was screwed in. The new system borrowed from Winchester's emerging slide-action shotgun, the 1893, using the same clamping system and center pin off of the magazine. The forestock was reinforced somewhat thanks to a second cross screw and escutcheon. While earlier guns were only marked on the underside tang, around serial number 55,000, with some error on either side for assembly, Winchester markings begin to appear on the top of the barrels. Here we have one on an optional Damascus barrel. While shorter barreled options had always been popular for police and security use, it took a while to settle on 20 inches as the standard. At first this was just a common custom request, but in 1897 Winchester began marketing a Riot gun factory 20-inch barrel cylinder board expressly for use with buckshot. Marketing materials stated that the Riot gun was far superior to a revolver for shooting in the dark where aim is uncertain. Now, overall, the Winchester 1887 remained a somewhat less popular sporting gun. It had been preceded by the Spencer pump action, which it thankfully outsold well. However, that was almost a given with Winchester's presence in the market at the time. While there are certainly fans, no one seemed to distinctly prefer a lever action operation on a shotgun. It created a situation where the bore was fairly high, and the rocking action wasn't great for keeping on sight. Just 6 years after introducing the 87, Winchester would hedge their bets with a proper pump. Another work of John Moses Browning, the Model 1893 was certainly closer to a modern shotgun, at least as we look back from today. However, it too suffered a number of teething issues. Frankly, the slide action or pump action required a little more consideration towards intuitive design, so for a time the 1887 was not bumped out of production. Winchester's engineers reworked the 1893 to make it both safer and easier to use, however. This became the Model 1897, which at its debut still lacked some polishing and extra features that would come over the next few years. As it built up steam, the 1897 began to displace interest in the 1887, and frankly, Winchester didn't have much interest in cannibalizing their own repeating shotgun market. So, in March of 1899, production of the 1887 was halted with approximately 64,855 completed. The surplus lasted until early 1900. Winchester did say that they would have more available in late summer, but it seems they were planning on some major changes, because what came next was the model of 1901, basically the same as the improved Model 1887, but critically only available in 10 gauge. There were no plans to produce the 1897 pump action in 10 gauge. It was likely just too cumbersome and expensive to arrange a whole their assembly line tooling, etc. 10 gauge was also at this time failing in popularity, likely because smokeless powders had yielded a wider range of power for the 12 gauge cartridge. But the tooling for the 1887 10 gauge was already set up, so keeping Winchester's hand in the market was possible for a very low setup cost. They just had to make some tweaks for the new smokeless powders that were in the market. Just from the outside, we can see the color case hardening was abandoned. That color had been a byproduct of surface hardening, but with big smokeless cartridges, it wasn't enough. So a more controlled, better heat treatment was done, which gave strength throughout the receiver. Since this left a plain steel finish, the 1901s were blued. Winchester marketed the new shotgun as having a tighter breech joint, though I'm unsure how the fitting was changed. They did add a positive firing pin retractor instead of the simple springback that we saw here. The pin also appears to have been beefed up and lengthened. A lever lockup was also taken from an earlier patent, which had already been applied to their model of 1895 rifle. This was designed to keep the action locked shut until the user pressed down on the inside of the lever. I should also point out that the 1901 was chambered for a 2 7/8 inch 10 gauge cartridge. Now, I do not have a Model 1901 here. We were sadly unable to borrow one ahead of this episode, but what I do have, however, is a Zhongzhou Machine Works clone, what they call their PW87, produced in China. Curiously, despite being in 12 gauge, it's actually a copy of the Model 1901, not the 1887, so we'll use it to take a closer look. Alright, ignore the length, because this was not standard for a 1901, and I don't believe they even offered a Riot length for it, but if we work our way back, we'll see this is really new. We have laser engraving on the side. This is a reproduction. So our scale and some of our features are going to be slightly off. Plastic thick butt pad. Clearly the wood is of modern quality. But thankfully, when they made these guys, they copied all the features of the upgraded 1887s plus changes that were made for the 1901. So this is a really good example of the last version of these guns, except for the part where it's in 12 gauge. This should only have been in 10 gauge for the 1901. That's because, again, they didn't want to cannibalize the Winchester 1897's market. Now, what is actually different? Where are our upgrades? Well, let's take a look. At the front, our soldered lug and screw have been replaced with a sort of pin coming off the front. I don't know. There we go. I can show you that better. We've got a pin and just sort of like a cap coming off the front of the magazine, which is screwed on. And then that pin meets a clamp here that is screwed through in order to clamp both sides of the barrel. That's what hangs on the front of the barrel for the magazine. This is a carryover from the pump action shotgun line. And then our forestock now has 1, 2 screws in their escutcheons in order to hold it together much stronger. If we look inside, we see we have a separate extractor now on the right side of the gun, and then on the left side extractor, we have a reinforcement underneath that little piece just below. That prevents this extractor from being driven too low just before closing the breech, preventing it from snapping off by being up under the groove where it's supposed to go and pop. The same thing is prevented on this side by a locating pin that is provided by this little secondary screw. As a matter of fact, on the other side of the gun, this same thing was tried by putting a screw right about here, which doesn't exist on this gun because it's opted for the better lever system or finger system. But you may encounter some 1887s but never 1901s that have that screw there, which not on this gun. Now, everything I mentioned could be true of a late 1887. What's specific to 1901 is, one, this lever here, which, as you can see, has a hinge on it. You might be able to make out that little lever there. So let's go ahead and flex on this guy. You can see with that flex, we release from this hook, and therefore we're able to drop the lever. Now, the big reason for this would be to prevent this from opening inertially if you drop the gun or bap it around. And if it opens inertially, you may throw a casing out and generally be unprepared for what's to come at you. So this means that only by user operation, i.e. flexing this lever out, can you open the gun. The sear mechanism should work mostly the same. I will say something that I can't show you easily in here, and I'm not actually 100% sure if it's in this exact reproduction of the gun, because this is, again, not a true 1901. They did add a direct firing pin retractor to the mechanism. Unfortunately, I can't guarantee the authenticity of one in this piece because I haven't actually pulled apart a 1901 to look at it. So even if I found something in here, I couldn't tell you if it was exactly the same just yet. We did put out a call for loan on these guys, but unfortunately, no one came through on that one. So otherwise, this is generally what you'd see in a 1901 if it weren't a Chinese reproduction. At its introduction, the 1901 would cost you $30. Standard configuration was a 32-inch full choke barrel, but like the 1887, various customizations and upgrades were available. Markings weren't as hidden on the 1887. Model 1901, along with Winchester's branding, was present on the barrel. The upper tang was just marked Winchester. Most 1901s have their choke marked on the barrel as well. There was, however, no factory riot gun version of the 10 gauge. That market was taken up by the pump action 1897, which makes this an even weirder clone, but anyway. It's clear the 1901 was geared towards customers who wanted to do heavy waterfowling or even moderate ground game with buckshot. Given the niche use case, it's no surprise that the 1901 sold much more poorly than the 1887, with production halting at the end of 1919, plus some parts cleanup and assembly over the next 10 years. Only 13,814 1901s would be produced. And while that would certainly make it more rare than the 1887, just on the face of it, other factors come into play to possibly limit the availability of these smokeless 10 gauges. A 1935 article in the American Rifleman, specifically recalling the history of the Winchester lever shotgun, made note that as no other 10 gauge repeater had been made available since the 1901, waterfowl hunters, still enamored with the cartridge, sought them out specifically, often paying the same price for a used example as they had been produced new. That means attrition could be a bit high as they were put back to work time and time again, whereas the 87s, more numerous to begin with, were set aside. Now that should be the end of our story, but I actually happen to have a tale for all of you. Again, coming from the American Rifleman, Colonel H.P. Sheldon recounts the story of what he calls a Winchester 1901 purchased from a pawn shop in France. He goes on to say that it was a 12 gauge and later recalls it could only chamber the 2 5/8 inch case, which would definitely make it an 1887, not a 1901. Anyway, his story goes that a young company commander training with his U.S. machine gunners in Vosges purchased the used gun in order to hunt local game during his limited free time. When the unit was deployed to the front, he was loath to leave the gun behind, and so it was carried along with a healthy supply of hand-loaded cartridges intended for boar hunting. These would be on the order of 000 buck shot. Once on the front, they found the shotgun more useful for taking pot shots at noises in the night, as opening up with the machine gun would invite enemy shelling, so they'd have to move after each engagement. Supposedly, at least one German soldier was dropped dead attempting to sneak up in the dark. The writer morbidly includes that he was found still clutching a photo of his wife and children back home. The incident rather spoiled the war for a few days, recalled the colonel. At some point, our commander was wounded and spent nearly a year in recovery still in France. The unit kept the Winchester, and after the armistice, it found its way back to its original owner, now battered, without varnish, and all the bluing and case hardening flaked away into a dull, sad gray. He apparently still made use of it for game back home in the US before hanging it up for lack of shorter, shelled ammunition with which to feed it. While there isn't much in the way of proof, the article is an interesting tale that is not likely to be entirely fabricated, though highly likely to be embellished. Even so, I'm going to use it as an excuse to at least try some black powder buckshot in this old gun. Okay, that's a little intimidating. All right, hopefully we all understand this lever shotgun a lot better. So now's the time when we get to hear from Mae about how well it shoots. All right, we made room for Mae.
Hi.
And we have just enough room for our 30-inch barreled Winchester 1887.
Thank you.
You have fired this gun with both bird and buck now.
I have.
We're not always going to do buckshot in this series. We just happened to want to do it on this one because of the story of using it in World War I, and presumably that was a full-barreled gun too. Mm-hmm. But we just thought it'd be funny.
Worth the experience, at least.
And we kind of messed up because we used double-aught buck because that's what we had available. Triple-aught would have been a little heavier.
That would have been interesting.
But, yeah. All right, so the 1887. You're handed this gun for the first time.
Okay.
You know it's a shotgun, a repeating shotgun.
Sure.
Your experience up to this point in time in 1887 would probably be
the Spencer.
The Spencer, and I mean technically this is not the first lever action shotgun. There was, oh good lord, I believe it was a Scandinavian design with an external lever operating principle.
Would I have come across that though?
No, this is extremely rare to this day. I would love to borrow one if anybody has one, but no, it's a very uncommon gun. Sure. So they're technically, it was beat to market. There's also, in theory, repeating shotguns ahead of the Spencer, maybe. I'm actually having a hard time proving some things I've seen, because inventors make stuff and then they don't always put dates down.
Right.
But this series, for the shotgun at least, is supposed to be trying to go in chronological order with stuff that you would be able to find and buy. So, in a popular notion, you would have been marketed the Spencer pump guns.
Okay.
And then very quickly, this would have become available in the market. Just a couple of years later.
All right.
So Winchester now, instead of this unknown, well, I mean, Spencer had a big name, but instead of this other little company, this big powerhouse Winchester comes out and he says, we have the perfect repeating shotgun.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is what they would have come out with?
Yeah, and this shows up in the box.
Uh-huh.
What you got? How you feeling when it comes out of the box? Obviously, it would be cleaner than this.
Well, I'm a little surprised. Shotgun and lever shotgun. Those two things combined seem a little bit strange to me in general, inherently.
Yeah, even to this day, it's kind of a rare thing. You tend to see it in 410s, really. It's where you see lever shotguns.
For 12 gauge, though, interesting. And then 10 gauge later on, right?
Yes. Oh, going even bigger.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, at least I've got 5 rounds, like a chamber in the mag. That's actually pretty decent.
It's also very easy to top up. Like, extremely easy to load one in the chamber or onto the elevator.
Right. Kind of nice, actually.
Okay.
But ergonomically speaking, let's start from the top. Well, actually, pretty good length. It's a 30-inch barrel on this shotgun. I know it can come in various sizes as well, so that's nice for being able to change my accessories. Balance point for this one with the 30 is actually right here with the receiver. That's pretty decent.
Yeah.
That means a lot of the weight to the rear, which is great. The swing on it feels pretty dang comfortable, I would say. I feel like I'm able to really do some really good shifting with that.
Now, that matters a lot for people in that era because if you're trying to quickly change between aerial targets, you don't want to have too much mass at the front.
Right.
But then there's also people that argue you need enough to be able to pull and hold. But generally, shotguns are shot on the move. And so coming from something like the Spencer, where you've got all this mass out in front of you,
Right.
this is probably an advantage to have all of the action to the rear.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very comfortable with that. And then the cheek height is actually pretty level with the rear sight. Well, the rear trough. Not too bad there.
Is it a natural pointer when you throw it up?
Let's see. Actually, yeah, it settles well in with my line of sight. Like I'm actually able to see right down it when I look there.
Yeah, I found the bore axis on this being a little bit higher than you'd expect. Kind of helps at least dry handling. Because for a modern shooter that's used to height over bore guns or, being in a taller perspective or guns that are sort of post body armor,
right?
Having something that sits just a little bit higher is not unnatural to us. I don't feel like I'm leaned up over it.
No.
So I don't feel like I have to get aggressively low on this gun. I have to just sort of, that's nice.
It settles well, so it feels you're just resting your head gently like on a pillow.
Okay. And then I guess...
From there, it's just working the gun pretty
much.
Right.
How's the action?
Well, I've had lever guns before, so I'm not unfamiliar with the action itself. However, I will say...
What was your most favorite lever rifle we've done so far?
My most favorite?
We've done like the Winchester 1892, which was like the 4440.
Yep.
We've done the Winchester 1894 and 3030.
Yep, done the 95.
Yeah, the Russian 95. That was your least favorite, but
that
not
was still my least favorite.
Necessarily that gun's fault, but probably that gun's fault.
That wasn't great. You know what? It's a difficult choice between the 92 and the 94 because both of them, the actions were quite smooth and easy to operate. Now,
would you consider this as smooth?
No.
Really?
Well, it's somewhere in between the 95 and those 92, 94s, frankly, because it's very clunky. I can feel every single instance of it. So right here at the very beginning, and the hammer is cocked, so...
Well, yeah, that's going to make it different.
Yeah.
Go ahead and ease that down.
Okay.
How's that work, by the way?
A little bit annoying that's the way to be able to ease it down.
The hammer spur is extremely small.
It's very, very tiny, and that's great. It doesn't snag on anything. But then when it comes to decocking it...
It's shrouded, too.
Or even putting it into the half-cock position, it's kind of an awkward ride there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to open the action. Okay, well, that's about as much assistance as I get as to right here. Okay?
Yeah, there is a little bit... So the way this gun tends to work is... And I'm sorry... There's not a lot of documentation on this gun in terms of every individual operation of the firearm.
Does that mean we'll see another episode come out someday?
They've already seen the animation by this point. Because Bruno and I worked hard on this one. We believe, as far as we can tell, because we can't see what's happening in the gun, but there is some tension holding it closed, which appears to be the mainspring traveling over center, and there's just a little bit of mainspring bias. Okay. And then when you open it up, you overcome that and it just sort of...
And that's the mainspring with the hammer, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so you get there's only really the mainspring in this gun. I mean, it's mostly the mainspring doing most of the things in this gun.
Right.
It does a lot of things.
And you can see it right there.
But it kind of punks it open just a little bit as you travel over center. If you don't have the hammer down, if you have it cocked, it will throw itself open.
Oh, yeah.
Because the mainspring is now powered up from holding the hammer. Yeah.
So then that gives me a whole lot of help. But that's presumably, I'm not opening it when it's already cocked.
Right. That's not realistic. You'd be shooting and then levering.
Right. Okay. So with the hammer cocked, this is as far as it's going to go. It's not going to go any further without your assistance from there. And when I start to move it, well, there's a weird clunk right there. I'm not really sure what that was. Another weird clunk. I can feel it dragging on the inside. Nothing about that just sounds or feels smooth. Listen. You could hear it. even just grinding against the sides.
And then when you get to your end stroke, several things happen at once.
Several
you haven't
things
even gone
happen.
all the way yet.
Have I not?
No.
Oh, wait. Okay, yeah, they were in the elevator. Duh, I'm stupid. I forgot about the elevator.
And that's also a big part of this gun is you can't short stroke it. You have to drive the lever all the way forward.
Right.
How far forward is that exactly?
It is a huge travel. That is over, I think that's got to be over 90 degrees, right?
It's hard to say. It's not quite at 90. No,
right
it's
there.
not quite at 90 there, but it's close.
It's still really far.
Yeah, the arc is impressive.
The arc from back end to back end.
So you're shooting and you've got to go prompt.
Right.
Like a full-length rifle action, lever action from before the innovations that we see in the 1894. Which, I mean, it is from before that, so...
Yeah, fair. Frankly, unfortunately, my knuckles took another beating once again that day from repeated use of this one.
Well, yeah, because actually, you know, it's very comparable to Kropatschek magazines, because at the end of travel, you've already opened up the breech, the bolt's already out of the way, but the elevator doesn't want to come up until it receives a positive impact from the breech block. And that positive impact is supposed to hook it in some way to cause it to tip up to feed the next round.
Sure.
We see that in a linear bolt action, and we've already commented on that being a little awkward because you have to get back, like on a lapel.
Right, you have to pop it hard,
Right.
Otherwise the round may just be sitting in the carrier and the carrier is still down.
Yeah. So then, on the same thing on this gun, you've got to but instead of just this bolt action where you're pulling something apart like this, you're rocking into your other hand like a big pair of scissors. And so you use inertia to kind of eat that up. But
and then I'm not resting it exactly directly on a knuckle. I feel like somehow that would be easier, but it's more like it's hitting in between the knuckles, which it's really not a great placement for having to put a lot of force.
It's a little unpleasant because you have to make sure that you're really swinging to get it to feed correctly. So if you were to play with this gun a lot, I'm sure you could get it honeyed into just the right spot. It would stop hurting your knuckles. But as a course of natural action as a first-time shooter on it,
If it was smooth, if the extraction had been butter the whole time, I'm sure I wouldn't have thought anything of it. But unfortunately, this one kind of really... it gave me difficulty on extraction, I noticed, a lot of the time.
I actually find it to be fairly smooth opening. For my taste.
I mean, that's without any rounds in it or without it gunked up. Look at him. He's going to already go against me.
But Mae is right. Once you start adding cartridges or any sort of snag in the system, which, by the way, this system is very prone to doing. Sorry, I'm trying to ride that trigger close. This system's very prone to having feed issues. Actually, they worked hard to improve it. So a number of the features we talked about, like moving that support finger over to the left side, which then
helps
also
keep the extractor pushed up, right?
It does, but it also helps. So it's an anti-dive for the extractor, but it's also doing things to keep the feed lips going down faster, so that therefore there's less pressure on the feed going forward. So this being a first year, if somebody's shot one of these and they're going, well, mine doesn't quite feel like that, or you have a 1901 or something, they have improvements in the feed. Being a first year, this has the very worst feed out of all of them. The extractor is more likely to slip off.
Oh, so you gave me the worst one of all.
If you try to use this gun slowly, like we saw in the video, it will jam.
Oh, yeah.
It has to be used with some rapidity or it will not feed.
And even I thought I was doing okay, but I was still having some snags here and there. And especially one, it just failed to extract. It only extracted it partially, even just out of the chamber. So then I had to reseal the action and really bust it open again a second time.
Sure. And the reason it feeds better when it's under inertia is because there's this point at which it has to kind of ram. You feel that, you know? You're exposed to that in the gun. So not quite the same dry as running it.
No, definitely not. But otherwise, in terms of just overall description, I think that pretty much covers all the description other than just actually shooting it.
Well, no, we haven't really said anything about loading it. Do you recall that?
Honestly, it's not a system I'm unfamiliar with, even though it's a shotgun, and we don't shoot a lot of shotguns for the series, but I'm not unfamiliar with the whole carrier having to press it down in order to load rounds into a tube. Man, that sounds familiar. We talked about before. It's like the label and the Kropatscheks, essentially, just having to feed it into the tube. You have to know to get it out of your way. Right. So that was the really only awkward moment, which is making sure that carrier was pushed down. But otherwise, it wasn't really very difficult. Nothing really wanted to bite my thumbs or anything like that. That wasn't weird.
Yeah, for having to reach deep in the action, I never did bend a fingernail on it.
No, which is nice, because we've had that experience before.
Oh, yeah. Even so, like Browning, we haven't covered it yet, but Browning Auto 5s, you have to flip them over, hold the button, get it in there.
They just want the tip of my thumb every single time.
It depends. It depends on the length of that gate. But then... I've definitely had other guns. I guess we'll get to them some other day. But I've other guns try to eat my thumb.
Oh, yeah.
This doesn't even have an external access. You have to open the breech and go in through the top of the breech, which is actually very novel to this. I mean, when do you normally see that? I guess, well, we did play with the Spencer, which was
that's what I was thinking, the Spencer.
It's got its own weird issue, too, for loading.
Right.
And then you have to carry... You don't have to carry the one.
There's that.
It's in there. So, all right, we get it loaded.
Yep.
The action is generally okay, but very cantankerous.
Cantankerous, I like that.
The actual surfaces themselves are slick. I want to point that out. If it seems like we're manipulating this fine, the surfaces are fine. It's all the things you're trying to get it to do that are not fine.
Yeah, that's when everything kind of starts to get a little bit jerky and snaggy.
Right. All right. We get one in the chamber.
Yep.
With a little effort.
Little effort.
You go to pull the trigger. How's that?
So I remember from when you took it apart, because you actually had already taken it apart before we went to the range, that it was a single stage trigger. So that I wasn't surprised by. What I was surprised by was just how light it was.
Oh,
I wasn't expecting that.
It's a really lovely trigger.
I don't know why. Yeah, it's quite lovely.
It's kind of small and thin though, so you're just like, boom.
Yeah, and there's no travel at all, and just it goes, and it's great.
Okay.
I thought it was actually pretty fantastic.
So no disadvantage on tracing your shot and just going ahead and pulling through that trigger.
Yeah, no, I know the moment that I'm ready to take my shot, I'm going to be able to take my shot pretty quickly. That was great. I like that.
And then recoil.
Middle of the road, same as the Spencer. It's 12 gauge. I mean, double aught buck was worse. So.
Would you say the double aught buck rocked you at all?
I mean, it gave me a good shove, but I didn't think it was unmanageable. I guess is the way to think about it.
Yeah, and then birdshot obviously isn't doing much either. So I would think that the high bore axis really isn't that big of a deal on a gun like this.
Definitely not.
However, it's only when it's like this. If you're trying to load up heavy 10s, which some people did.
It'd be fun. I'd try that.
Or a insane rifle cartridge like we saw in our episode, then we start to have some issues.
I would certainly want to try that one day.
Yeah.
That looked amazing.
Yeah, I would shoot it. It's just, it's not a great idea, but I'm going to shoot it. So, I guess, let's see, how many birds did you break with this? 4 out of 5?
Yeah, I got 4 out of 5. I think I missed the third one out of all of them, and I don't think I think I trailed behind it a little too much.
And we had one extraction problem.
One severe extraction problem. In general, I would say extraction was overall, it got worse as time went on. But yeah, one definitely stuck very badly. The
extraction issues, unfortunately, this is a bad test example for that because it's a very early one that was never sent in for double extraction upgrade or any of the other little changes they made. So that might not have happened if we had a later model or a 1901. But I'm kind of glad we had it because we can at least show, even with just a 5-round test. I will say we probably shot a couple rounds before that and didn't experience it.
I mean, we did some test shots, in general.
Yeah. We've shot a few rounds without any problems, and then we did our 5-round test. So maybe out of less than 20 rounds to the gun, we had at least one failure. So that's not a very good rate.
No, it's not great at all.
That includes filming and not filming, by the way. But now that we've shot this episode, I can go shoot it some more, I guess.
Yeah, there you go.
I want to try it.
Play with it.
I want to try it at sporting clays and just like go around and just go, can I play?
Oh, that'd be so much fun.
The old guys would love it. Like every time I go to sporting clays with something weird,
they're watching you.
Yeah. I took a Widowmaker and everybody was so happy.
That one's an interesting one. We do need to do an episode on that someday.
Okay, so overall though, how do you compare this to, say, the Spencer pump action?
While the action is pretty straightforward, and maybe you could even argue this one might be more robust than the Spencer, I would still take the Spencer over this one.
I disagree.
I think the pump action is just easier to operate.
I think
it makes more sense.
The pump action is far more intuitive, but I disagree in one regard. It depends on what you're doing. If those are my only two choices, and I'm told that I need to defend myself with buckshot in a cylinder bore shotgun, I'm taking Spencer. If I'm told that I need to buy one...
You pointed this one said Spencer, by the way.
Oh, well, the Winchester... I'm sorry. I'm taking the Spencer, not the Winchester.
Okay.
So I think there's a Spencer somewhere on the wall. Yeah, right there.
Spencer.
Here we go.
Okay. Oh, well, good job. They're at the same pointing distance.
Yeah, look. I got it. So this guy, much better for defense, much better for an all-around shotgun, I think. Weighs. Do you want to compare those two, actually? Especially being an early one?
Yeah, the heft on that is tremendously different.
It's bad. This thing's utilitarian.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, the action's exposed, which means there's a chance for more external damage over time.
Oh, the action's exposed? That's
only when you open it, though. That's only when you open it.
Okay.
I think there's a lot more that can go wrong with this gun. However...
You're not wrong. A lot can get into the top right there.
Having taken a number of these apart, a lot of them have repairs that were clearly done by regular blacksmiths or early gunsmiths. Or not literally.
Do you think that one's easier to service than this one?
An amateur gunsmith can service one of these back then.
Okay.
Whereas if something breaks in that, God help.
There's a lot of curved surfaces in here. That sounds like a nightmare.
The mainspring alone is a very particular piece in that gun.
It's huge, too.
There is no one thing in that gun other than maybe the screws that could be replicated easily. Right. Whereas as cumbersome as this is, most of the stuff in this gun can be replicated by hand very easily and serviced very easily. Mm-hmm. So if I'm told I can only have one of these guns, utilitarian-wise, I'm going to choose this one, unfortunately.
Yeah.
However, this is clearly less refined than this is. The design on this is beautiful. The mechanics
there is elegance along with this one, I will say that.
This gun has not received enough attention, to be honest with you guys. Like, the 1887 is the unloved stepchild of John Moses Browning, and it's a fantastic piece of engineering. I mean, the engineering is frankly remarkable. I'm flabbergasted no one's described it in detail before we have in this sort of like, no, this tips this does that. Mm-hmm. Especially like the sharing of resources from the mainspring and things like that. However, as much as I'm saying I like this gun because it sounds like, wait, why would I disagree with you if I say I like this one? I will say for sport shooting, for
specifically, trap, okay, for,
like two shot trap, mm-hmm. I actually do believe that I would exhaust myself less with that gun. The weight is much better. Like, mm-hmm. try the swing again.
Yeah, it does have a good swing. I will say that.
All right, so I mean. Let's ease the hammer down because we don't want to dry fire it with that mainspring. Okay. All right, so I just want you to start from your right and move left, and in the middle, just rack it.
Okay.
Okay, presuming you've done
That's assuming the extraction works properly.
Right.
And also.
Yeah, that's fine, though, because you're just playing a game. It's not, you're not hunting for food. You're playing a game. If you have a jam, it's not the end of the world, right? All right, so same thing. Deal? Yeah, you're going to ease. Remember, that's your spur, so you can ride that. There you go. And then just do the same thing, right to left, and get a pump in the middle of it.
Oh, okay. You're not wrong.
See what I mean? It's still a fairly stiff action.
You're not wrong. It is pretty stiff.
Now, we're going to see shotguns that come out very quickly after this that blow both of these away. But in that one moment, I think this is the better repeater for not bird gunning, but like competitive bird shooting or target shooting.
Well, that should be a new series we do, is just on the shotguns, competitive bird shooting.
The only problem with it, I think it falls way behind the doubles that were available. If you're shooting skeet, you only need 2 shots. You could get away with a double all day. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that beats out the doubles of the era.
I don't think it would either. No, not for that specific purpose.
Unless you can only own one shotgun. And if you only can own one shotgun and you think to yourself, well, I'm mostly going to shoot skeet with it. Mm-hmm. But sometimes I'll either go hunting, and back then there weren't, the magazine limits, or sometimes I might use it for personal defense.
That's when the magazine comes in handy. Then
it's like, that's kind of like a skeet gun that's moved towards the center. This is sort of a defensive utilitarian gun that's moved a little bit towards skeet. Like, yeah, it could do it, but it's really not for competition. This is for actually getting out there and
right. I would see working. That. You're not wrong. For skeet purposes, I could see that one being a little more cumbersome.
Oh, this thing's. Oh, I've shot sporting clay with this, and it is very jarring on the shoulder joints after a while.
I believe it.
But I think that's got us covered, right? Any final thoughts?
Everything, yeah. Like I said, I was pleasantly surprised by some things on this piece, with the trigger being as wonderful as it was, the swing actually being quite comfortable. However, man, I'm not kidding. Just the fact that the extraction was so poor on this one, I wish we'd had a 1901 example to really play with on range that same day, because you'd have seen reviews change from, what the hell are we doing, to, oh, that's so nice by comparison.
That's true. I don't know. Overall, I have mixed feelings about the 87 as an actual utility shotgun, but as a piece of engineering art, I'm not.
It's interesting.
It's beautiful. This is one of the few shows where this is something that belongs to us. I purchased that for a song years ago and just sort of tucked it away. And I actually had a parts one as well, just a receiver and some bits that came in handy because it turned out to have the features we needed for this episode. It was one of those in-betweens with the side screw.
There you go.
I didn't even realize it till we were already working on the episode. Mm-hmm. So I got kind of lucky, but I think I might keep it. It's too funky, and it's such a wonderful machine to show off. Like I actually really have fallen in love with that thing.
Well, speaking of this thing, in general, for the other ones used in this episode, I think for the close-ups, do we have any donors to thank for that?
We do. We have to thank my buddy Jameson.
Yeah,
thanks,
Jameson.
Actually loaned us an example. And then we actually, the 1901, I forgot who to thank. He gave me his name at the time. But the reproduction that we used for this episode, I was at a gun show. And I was like, I've been trying to get this 1901 for months. They're always so expensive. No one will loan me one. I can't really afford to just buy one and then play with it and liquidate it because we were trying to carry other things we were doing.
Yeah.
So I ran into somebody who had one on his table inexpensively. It was one of the Chinese-made ones. And when I was looking at it, I realized, wait, this has all the features.
All the updates.
Except for it's not in 10 gauge.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm sitting at a gun show going, I think I can use this as a stand-in for the 1901. We'll get this dang episode done because we've been meaning to move this episode along for a long time.
Right.
And the gentleman, I went to haggle with him about it, and he was just like, aren't you Othais? And I went, oh, crap.
Yeah, that's usually not a good moment.
But no, he was really sweet about it. So I just, if it's you, put it in a comment so I can thank you again. But he gave me his name at the time, and I've been doing so much work, I forgot, and I feel like a jerk.
Well, thank you, Jameson, and thank you, Anonymous Man. Well, for the partial loans, I guess.
The cheap price.
Right.
We'll go with that. And,
let's go with that.
All right. Well, I think.
And then no executive producers this episode, right?
No.
Okay.
So
no one wanted to claim the sad stepchild.
We have some coming up
of John of Winchester.
Right.
Sorry, I'm thinking John Moses Browning.
No, he did.
Oh yeah, that's right. He was. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Just really play that one at the end.
Yeah.
May learn nothing from this episode.
Nothing at all.
All right. Y'all have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
We should mention it because you were just watching the video that released moments ago to the public. But we won Gundy's Best Gun Reviewer.
Yeah, we did.
Which I was told that we won at a fairly significant margin, actually.
Cool.
We didn't put out a video or anything, so I guess you guys just were watching the gate on that one.
Yep.
So I really appreciate you guys looking out for us.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
I will some, but you know what the problem with him is? He won't take any pay.
No, he won't take any payment.
Which is why I won't let him do anything anymore.
The only payment he's accepting so far from me is food, in which case it's smoked meats.
Yeah,
that's why we're going to keep making smoked meats.
He gave us some beef ribs tonight, I know that.
Yeah, the beef ribs are great.
They are really good. It's actually very comparable to the old men at the gun show.
It is.
And you immediately went, yes, when they're like, oh, you know what that is? And you're like, yes, it's an 1895 Mannlicher straight pull. This one is in a pre-Spitzer cartridge. It's actually quite lovely. Yeah, that's a Italian straight pull Mannlicher. And you're like, well, no, it's Austrian. No, I'm pretty sure it was Italian. And do this again. To do so, I'll hold the hammer, pull the trigger, release the hammer, just like on letting down the hammer on a revolver. If I start pumping back, much heavier tension. All the way to this point, she's down. Then I'm going to start feeling tension from the hammer. See it cocking.